The rubble smelled like burned metal and old rain. Dara moved through the collapsed outpost with a torch in one hand and a scanner in the other. The ceasefire had been signed 6 days ago. Nobody expected survivors here. The orders were simple: sweep, document, and report back. Nothing more. The outpost had belonged to the Dravkin, a dragon species, ancient and private, known for building their settlements deep into rock and staying out of galactic politics until someone pushed too hard. Someone had pushed too hard. The eastern wall had come down in the bombardment. Half the structure was open to the sky now, and the sky above Ashvin 3 was the color of a fatting bruise. Dara stepped over a cracked support beam and swept the torch left. Empty corridor. Stepped right. More rubble. The scanner was picking up nothing: no heat, no movement, no biological signal, just stone dust and silence. Then something moved. It was faint, a shifting sound like dry leaves scraping against each other coming from behind a half-collapsed inner wall. Dara stopped, listened. It came again, not a sound of something large, but something small, something trying very hard to be quiet and failing only slightly. Dara crouched down and moved toward the wall slowly. There was a gap at the bottom where two slabs had fallen apart, just wide enough to shine the torch through. 7 pairs of eyes blinked back. They were small, each one no bigger than a large house cat, covered in scales that hadn't fully hardened yet. The scales caught the torchlight and scattered it in pale golds and greens. Their wings were folded tight against their bodies, pressed flat the way a frightened animal presses its ears down. Their tails were tangled together in a pile at the center of what looked like a sealed chamber, its roof still mostly intact. Dravkin hatchlings. Dara did not move, did not speak, just held the torch steady and looked at them. They looked back. None of them made a sound. They were shaking, all of them, faintly, a full-body tremor that Dara could see even from 3 meters away. But they did not scatter. They did not shriek. They just stared at the light with wide, pale eyes and held very still. Dara set the torch down sideways on the rubble so it cast soft, indirect light into the gap, then sat cross-legged on the ground in front of it. No sudden movements, no noise, just sat. The scanner buzzed once. 7 biological signals, juvenile, stable, and Dara silenced it without looking away from the gap. A minute passed, then another. One of the hatchlings moved. The smallest one, or at least the most forward one, scales a shade brighter than the others, eyes slightly too big for its head. It uncurled from the pile and crept toward the gap on tiny, uncertain legs. Stopped just inside the opening. Sniffed the air. Looked at Dara's face. Dara did not smile, did not reach out, just stayed still and breathed. The hatchling stepped through the gap. It crossed the distance between them in small, cautious steps, paused twice to look back at the others, and then climbed directly into Dara's lap, turned in a small circle like a dog finding its place, and sat down. Dara looked at it. It looked up at Dara, then it closed its eyes. The other 6 came through the gap over the next few minutes, not all at once, one by one in their own time, in their own order. The largest came last, moving more slowly than the rest. It did not climb into Dara's lap. It sat beside Dara's left leg instead, pressing its side against Dara's knee, and went still. By the time the rest of the squad arrived, boots crunching loud on the rubble from the far corridor, Dara was sitting in a collapsed Dravkin chamber with 7 dragon hatchlings distributed across both legs, one shoulder, and the ground within arm's reach. Corporal Ways shone his torch into the room and stopped walking. Dara. Yeah. What is that? 7 of them. Ways stared. Behind him, 2 more soldiers crowded the doorway. Someone said something in a low voice. Ways stepped forward and the hatchling on Dara's shoulder made a sound, a sharp, high click, and all 7 went rigid at once. Stop, Dara said. Ways stopped. The hatchlings did not calm down. They pressed tighter against Dara, the smallest one gripping Dara's sleeve with both front claws. The large one at Dara's knee had opened its eyes and was staring at Waze with an expression that required no translation. "They don't like you," Dara said. "They don't know me. Doesn't seem to matter." Waze looked at the scanner reading on his wrist. "They're juveniles. Can't be more than a few days out of the shell. We need to call this in." "Call it in then. You need to put them down first." Dara looked at the hatchling on the shoulder. It was still watching Waze. Its claws had not loosened. "I'll try," Dara said. The hatchling on the shoulder turned its head and looked directly at Dara's face, not with fear, with something that felt uncomfortably like a question. Dara tried to set it down. It held on. Dara stopped trying. "Call it in," Dara told Waze. "Tell them I'll be here." The Vorith rescue team landed at dawn. There were 4 of them, tall, gray-skinned and moving with the rigid efficiency of people who believed paperwork was a form of warfare. Their lead officer, Commander Rail, had a face built for delivering bad news and a voice that made every sentence sound like a legal summons. She stepped off the transport and looked at the temporary shelter Dara's squad had rigged over the ruined chamber entrance and said, without greeting anyone, "Where are the hatchlings?" Dara stepped forward, inside. "We will take custody now. Stand aside." "You can try," Dara said. "I'd recommend going slowly." Rail did not go slowly. She walked to the entrance, ducked through, and stepped into the chamber with the full presence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The reaction was immediate. All 7 hatchlings screamed. It was not a small sound. It was a layered, piercing sound, something between a bird's shriek and a cracking stone, that bounced off the walls and hit everyone in the corridor like a physical thing. The hatchlings scattered away from Rail and piled into the far corner, wings spread and overlapping, the largest one planting itself in front of the others with its teeth bared. They were shaking so hard their scales clicked against each other like loose tiles. Rail stepped back instinctively. The sound cut off, not because they calmed down, but because they were too frightened to keep making noise. Dara moved past Rail, crossed the room quietly and crouched down near the hatchlings. The large one, Finn, Dara had started calling it, because it had to be called something, looked up, recognized Dara and leaned forward. The shaking slowed. One by one the others unstacked themselves from the corner and pressed around Dara's legs. Rail stood at the entrance and watched this without speaking for a long moment. "They will adjust," she said finally. "They haven't adjusted to anyone else in 36 hours, Dara said. "My whole squad tried, the medic tried, the supply officer tried bringing food. Same result every time. I will send for a Drovkin handler." "That's a good idea." The Drovkin handler arrived 3 hours later, a middle-aged male named Bovi, one of the few Drovkin working in interspecies liaison. He was careful, quiet, and clearly experienced with juveniles. He spoke softly in the Drovkin tongue as he entered the room. The hatchlings panicked faster than they had with Rail. Bovi stood in the doorway, visibly shaken, while inside the chamber Dara sat in the middle of 7 terrified dragon hatchlings and looked, if anything, slightly tired. "They are rejecting their own species," Bovi said quietly. "They're rejecting everyone," Dara said, "except me." A 4th person appeared at the entrance. Shorter than Rail, wearing a different uniform, Civilian Research Corps, pale blue, with a scanning device in each hand and an expression of barely contained scientific excitement. This was Dr. Owen, a Vorith xenobiologist, and he had arrived on the same transport as Rail but had been too busy reading equipment readings to get out immediately. "Remarkable," Owen said. "Doctor," Rail said, with a tone that suggested she had been tolerating him for some time. "No, truly remarkable. Look at the readings." Owen pushed forward between the others and held up his scanner without entering the room. "Their distress signals are completely flat when the human is in contact with them. Flat. I've never seen a bonding response this clean outside of documented parent-to-offspring interaction. They're not bonded, Rail said. Bonding takes weeks of deliberate imprinting. These hatchlings are 3 or 4 days old. The data disagrees with you, Commander. Owen was already scribbling notes on a secondary device. This is a fear suppression response. The hatchling nervous system is running a full biological calm protocol. Whatever the human is doing, or more accurately, whatever the human is not doing, is triggering it. Dara looked up. I'm not doing anything. That, Owen said with great significance, is exactly the point. Rail crossed her arms. We cannot leave a human soldier in long-term custody of Dravkin hatchlings. There are protocols. There are species rights frameworks. There are. The small hatchling, Soli, Dara had named it, after it had knocked over a water container 3 times in a row, climbed up Dara's arm and sat on the top of Dara's head. It surveyed the room from there with enormous self-importance. Rail stared at it. Owen made a small, involuntary noise of delight and wrote something down very fast. Dara reached up slowly, lifted Soli off the top of its head, and set it back in its lap. Soli immediately started chewing on Dara's sleeve. I'm not trying to keep them, Dara said. I'm trying to tell you that right now I'm the only option that doesn't send them into shock. Figure out a plan. I'll stay until you do. Rail looked at the hatchlings. She looked at Dara. She looked at the hatchling currently eating Dara's uniform. She left the room. Owen stayed. He pulled out a third scanner and started running baseline comparisons without asking anyone's permission. This is going to be very important data, he said, mostly to himself. Great, Dara said. Soli had moved on from the sleeve and was now attempting to eat the torch. Stop that, Dara said. Soli did not stop. Nobody came up with a plan in a day or a week. So Dara stayed. The temporary shelter expanded into a proper arrangement. A sealed habitat module pulled from the base camp stores, large enough for 7 growing hatchlings and 1 human to exist in without anyone sitting on anyone else. It had climate controls, a feeding station, and a small separate sleeping area that Dara used for approximately 4 hours a night before something climbed on top of the sleeping bag and made further sleep a negotiation. The hatchlings grew fast. In the first week, they doubled in size. Their scales hardened into defined patterns, each one distinct enough that Dara could tell them apart at a glance even in low light. Their legs grew stronger. Their wings, which had been soft and crumpled at first like wet paper, dried and stretched and became real things, capable of short, clumsy bursts that mostly resulted in collisions. Dara gave them all names, because the alternative was pointing and saying, the one that keeps biting. Soli was the bold one, always first, always loud, always doing something it had clearly decided was a good idea without consulting anyone. Fen was the quiet one, the largest, the most watchful, the one that did not climb on Dara or chew equipment, but simply existed within arm's reach at all times like a very large, very serious shadow. The others fell into their own patterns. Pip was terrified of the climate control unit and had to be reassured every time it cycled. Reed and Moss were inseparable and communicated with each other in a private, rapid clicking language that Owen spent 3 days trying to decode before admitting it was probably not language at all. Just 2 hatchlings who had decided to make the same sounds at the same time. Burr slept more than the others. Chalk, the palest one, scales almost white at the edges, was the one that sat at the habitat window and watched the Ashvin 3 sky for hours every day without moving. Owen visited twice a day. He was professional about it, would ask permission to enter, would move slowly, and had learned after the first session that if he pointed his scanner directly at any hatchling without warning, Soli would bite the scanner. He documented everything with a thoroughness that Dara found both reassuring and faintly unsettling. Do you feel protective of them? Owen asked one afternoon, while Fen slept across Dara's feet. Yes, Dara said. Is that new for you, or a general trait? Dara thought about it. Both, I think. Owen wrote something down. The Drovkin hatchling bonding response is normally triggered by a parent. It's a very specific biological event. The parent's scent, their resonance frequency, their emotional output. The hatchling nervous system locks on and uses the parent as a reference point for what is safe. Everything that matches the parent stays safe. Everything that doesn't is a threat. So they think I'm their parent. Not exactly. They know you're not their parent, their biology can tell the difference. But your presence is somehow producing the same neurological result as a parent would. Their fear circuits are off when you're here. They're not off for anyone else. Not Drovkin, not Vorith, not any of the other species on this base. And you don't know why. I have 17 competing theories, Owen said, with the energy of someone who found this delightful, and none of them are satisfying yet. Day 15 brought something new. Solely started mimicking sounds. Not language, just sounds. The click of the habitat lock. The specific sound Dara's boots made on the floor. At some point Dara had started whistling without noticing, a low, tuneless habit from long hours alone, and on day 15 solely produced an approximation of it back. Not accurate, but recognizable. Dara stopped walking. Solely did it again, watched Dara's face. Dara whistled the first 4 notes of something simple. Solely responded with 3 of them, slightly off-key, very pleased with itself. Owen, observing from the corner, was absolutely vibrating with the effort of not reacting visibly. By day 22, the hatchlings were responding to their names, not perfectly, not every time, but enough. Fen would turn at its name almost always. Solely responded to its name only when it was done with whatever it was currently doing, which was exactly the wrong time. On the 22nd evening, Dara sat by the habitat window after the hatchlings were settled and watched the light fade over the Ashvin 3 lowlands. Fen came and sat beside Dara, not leaning, just present, its large pale eyes tracking the same horizon. Dara had not planned to stay 22 days, had not planned any of this. But there was something about sitting next to a being that trusted you without asking for a reason for that trust that made it difficult to think about leaving. Fen turned and looked at Dara's face, then looked back at the window. Dara did the same. Outside, somewhere far across the landing field, Commander Rail's transport had landed. She had not come alone this time. High Warden Suva had not flown in a transport in 40 years. That was the detail Owen passed to Dara the next morning quietly as they watched the arrival from a distance. Suva had come by personal ship, a Drovkin vessel, long and narrow, and built from a dark material that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. It had landed on the far edge of the field and Suva had walked the rest of the way. No escort, no ceremony. The base went strange when Suva arrived. Not panicked, just quiet and careful, the way a room goes quiet when something very old walks into it. Suva was larger than any Drovkin Dara had seen. Not dramatically larger, not a giant, but large in the way that certain things are large because time has compressed into them. The scales were deep gray, almost black at the ridges, and worn smooth in places that armor had once rubbed for decades. One wing sat slightly lower than the other from an old break healed imperfectly. Suva walked with a deliberateness that made every step look considered. Commander Rail met Suva at the edge of the landing field and said something Dara could not hear. Suva listened, looked once toward the habitat module and continued walking. Dara went back inside. The hatchlings were already unsettled. They could feel something different in the air. Solely was packing, which it never did, and Chalk had moved away from the window and pressed against the inner wall. Fen was standing at the center of the room with its wings half spread, which was a posture Dara had come to recognize as, "Something is coming, and I do not know what to do with that." "It's okay," Dara said, not because it was a certainty, but because Dara's voice was the thing that made it true for them. The hatchlings resettled, not calmly but less sharply. Suva arrived at the habitat entrance without announcement. Rail stood 2 steps behind, watching. Suva looked at Dara. Dara looked at Suva. "May I enter?" Suva asked. The voice was low and even, with an accent that made every word sound like it had been weighed before being released. "It's their space," Dara said. "They decide." Something shifted in Suva's expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition, the kind that comes when someone does something small that confirms a larger thought. Suva stepped into the entrance, just 1 step. The hatchlings did not panic. They did not rush to Suva either. They went still, all 7, and watched. Soli stopped packing. Chalk turned to look. Fen stayed in place, but its wings came down slowly back to its sides. Suva did not move further, just stood there and let them look. A long silence stretched out between everyone in the room. Rael's hand moved slightly toward a communication device and then stopped. She had the instinct to manage the moment and the discipline to know that would ruin it. Then Suva spoke, not to Dara, not to Rael, to the hatchlings in Dravkin, low and continuous, not a list of sounds but something that rolled like a tide. Dara did not understand a word of it, but the hatchlings understood. Something in their posture changed, not fear, not joy, but a kind of weight being acknowledged. Burr made a small sound. Chalk turned and went back to the window. Fen walked toward Suva and stopped 2 meters away, looked up. Suva looked down. Fen turned around and walked back to Dara and sat on Dara's foot. Suva watched this for a moment, then turned and walked out of the habitat without speaking further. Rael followed quickly. Dara heard voices outside, Rael's clipped and pressing, Suva's measured and brief. Then Rael came back to the entrance alone. "High Warden Suva has made a ruling," she said. "I heard it's fast for someone who took 40 years to take a transport," Dara said. Rael did not acknowledge that. "The High Warden says the bonding has occurred. Under Dravkin law, a completed bonding cannot be severed without causing neurological damage to the hatchlings. Therefore, the existing arrangement is recognized as necessary and lawful until the hatchlings reach juvenile independence, which is, in this species, approximately 3 years. Dara looked down at Fen sitting on 1 foot. 3 years, Dara said. There will be a formal assignment. You will be attached to the Dravkin liaison office with full support resources. You will not be a soldier in the traditional sense. You will be, Rael paused as if the category did not sit well with her, a guardian. Soli climbed up Dara's back and settled between the shoulder blades. It had decided this was a good spot days ago and returned to it often. "What does Suva think about a human doing this?" Dara asked. Rael was quiet for a moment. The High Warden said one more thing before leaving. It did not translate cleanly. "The closest I can render it is," another pause, "some nests are found, not built." Dara did not respond immediately. Outside, Suva's dark ship was already lifting from the far end of the field, rising without hurry into the pale sky of Ashvin 3. Chalk watched it from the window. Dara watched it from the room. Somewhere between them, the hatchlings made small sounds to each other in the morning quiet. Dara thought about 3 years. 3 years did not seem, in that moment, like very long at all. The story got out on a Thursday. Dara did not release it. Rael did not release it. Someone at the Dravkin liaison office filed a standard interspecies bonding report and tagged it routine. And somehow routine became the most read document on 3 different galactic news networks by the end of the week. The headline that spread fastest was from a Vorith outlet. "Human soldier BCOMES sole caretaker of DRAVKIN H8CHLINGS after all other species trigger fear response." The Keth network ran it differently. Dragon BABIES reject own kind bond with human instead. A human interest channel back on Earth simply ran. They chose her. They had the wrong pronoun. Dara sent a correction once and then stopped. The responses came in waves, and from directions Dara had not thought to watch. A group called the Galactic Species Integrity Council released a statement calling the bonding an unfortunate contamination of Dravkin juvenile development that must be studied and reversed. 3 Vorith academic institutions sent research requests. A human veterans group issued a public commendation that Dara had not asked for and did not want. Several Dravkin community leaders said the situation was a symptom of how the war had scattered their people and left their eggs unguarded. One of them said it was shameful. None of these people had ever been in the room. Dara read some of the responses and then stopped reading. Owen read all of them as part of his research process and arrived one morning looking more tired than usual. "There is a protest forming at the base perimeter," Owen said. "What kind?" "2 kinds. Opposite kinds. They are currently facing each other instead of the base, which is at least convenient for us." The hatchlings were at 7 weeks now, and the change in that time was remarkable. They were the size of large dogs, moving with growing coordination, their wings capable of sustained short flights that ended in controlled landings maybe 60% of the time. The habitat had been expanded twice. Soli had learned to open the inner door latch and had to be relocated to a different section twice a week, until Owen suggested adding a secondary lock that required 2 simultaneous movements, a problem Soli was visibly working on. They understood more now. That was the thing Dara had not fully prepared for. The noise from outside, the arguments, the broadcasts, the hum of attention around the base, reached them in ways Dara could not fully control. They could not read the reports, but they could read Dara, and they could feel the way the air around the base had changed. The human who was usually settled had become someone who checked communication devices too often and went quiet in ways that had a different texture than the old quiet. Soli reacted by becoming louder, more physical, more disruptive, not aggressive but restless, biting equipment, flying into walls on purpose, making noise when the outer corridor got busy with unfamiliar voices. Fen reacted by staying closer. It had always stayed close, but now it followed Dara into every section of the habitat, sat outside the sleeping area if Dara went in alone, pressed against Dara's side during meals. Not afraid, watchful. The way a large, capable creature watches when it decides that something nearby needs protecting. On the 31st day since the story broke, Dara was sitting in the far corner of the habitat doing paperwork on a tablet when Fen came and sat directly in front of Dara, blocking the tablet from view. Dara looked up. Fen looked back. Its eyes, pale gold now, darkening at the edges, did not blink. "I'm fine," Dara said. Fen did not move. "The noise from outside isn't about you. It's about the idea of you. People get loud about ideas." Fen tilted its head slightly to the left, a habit that had developed around week 4 and that Owen had cataloged as probable processing behavior. "You don't need to worry," Dara said. Fen held eye contact for another long moment. Then it shifted and leaned its full weight against Dara's side and went still, not moving, not making a sound, just there, pressed against Dara with that specific weight of a large creature that has decided to be an anchor. Dara set the tablet down. Outside, someone was arguing into a broadcast device about species boundaries and the ethics of interspecies imprinting. The argument was long and used many important-sounding words. None of the words were the right ones. In the corner of the habitat, Dara sat with 7 hatchlings arranged around the space. Soli finally asleep across the water station. Reed and Moss clicked quietly at each other. Chalk at the window as always. Pip tucked against the warm panel near the climate unit. Burr in a loose sprawl in the center, and Fen against Dara's side. And the noise from outside did not get in. It was not a perfect solution. The noise would still be there tomorrow. But tonight, Fen had made the room quieter by the simple act of refusing to leave it. Dara leaned back against the wall and closed both eyes. Somewhere in the habitat, Soli made a small sound in its sleep that was almost exactly the four-note whistle. Almost. Owen's findings published on a quiet morning, 3 months after the story had first broken. The paper was long, 47 pages of data, analysis, cross-referenced biological measurements, and 17 revised theories collapsed into one. Owen had sent Dara a copy the night before with a message that said only, "I think you should read this first." Dara had read it. The central finding was not what anyone had predicted. It was not a scent. It was not a subaudible frequency. It was not something in human skin chemistry or electromagnetic output. Owen had eliminated all of those in the first 20 pages. What remained, what the data kept returning to, across 7 hatchlings and 11 weeks of continuous measurement, was something that did not have a clean scientific name yet. The Drovkin hatchling nervous system was extraordinarily sensitive to a class of signals Owen called emotional residue. Not current emotion. The system could read current emotion, but that was common across many species. What the Drovkin sensory apparatus could detect was something deeper, the pattern of what a creature had experienced and survived. Past grief, past fear, past loss, not as active signals, but as shapes pressed into the way a living thing moved, breathed, held itself. Most species, when this residue was measured, carried unresolved patterns: fear that had not completed its cycle, aggression that had no outlet, grief that had calcified into something defensive. The Drovkin hatchling system read these patterns the way a prey animal reads a predator, not always accurately but persistently. Any creature with unresolved residue registered as uncertain. Uncertain meant dangerous. Dangerous meant panic. Humans were different. Not because humans had less grief or less fear. The data showed the opposite. Human emotional residue was dense and complex in ways that surprised Owen and would likely surprise the broader research community. Humans carried enormous amounts of accumulated experience. Loss, specifically, appeared to be a pattern that ran through human biology at a structural level that other species did not match. And this was the part that had kept Owen revising for weeks. It was processed. Not resolved, not erased, processed. Humans felt things and then continued. They carried the shape of past pain without becoming the pain. The residue was present and complete. It had a beginning, a weight, and then an integration, a moment where the experience had been folded into the person rather than remaining stuck against the surface. To the Drovkin hatchling nervous system, this pattern read as something very specific. I have survived loss and I am still here. Not a threat signal, not a safety signal in any conventional sense. Something more precise than that, a signal that said, this creature has been through the hard thing and came through it whole. That kind of creature does not need to take anything from me to survive. That kind of creature is not afraid of me. The hatchlings had not bonded to Dara because Dara was calm or warm or made no sudden movements. They had bonded to Dara because somewhere in the biological record that every human carried without knowing it, there was a pattern that said, I know what it is to lose something, and I stayed anyway. The paper did not draw conclusions about what this meant for human-Drovkin relations or interspecies policy. Owen was careful about that. It ended with a simple line: further study is warranted. The implications are significant. Dara set the tablet down on the morning of the paper's publication and went out to the habitat. It was early. The Ashvin 3 sun was just beginning to clear the eastern ridge, turning the low clouds the color of warm copper. The hatchlings were mostly still asleep. Soli was upside down against the habitat wall in a position that should not have been comfortable. Burr was a loose pile in the center of the floor. The others were arranged in a loose cluster near the warm panel. Fen was at the window. Dara came and stood beside it, and they both looked out at the morning. Fen's wings were nearly full size now. Folded, they reached to the floor. Extended, they would span the width of the habitat. The scales along the jaw had come in dark and clean, and the pale gold eyes had deepened to something richer, the color of old light through water. They stood there for a while. The sun came up further. The light moved across the floor of the habitat in a slow, flat line. Fen made a sound low, not a click or a shriek, but something in between, the kind of sound that didn't require translation because it was not trying to say a thing. It was just being made, the way a person makes a sound when they are sitting somewhere good, and there is no particular reason to be silent. Dara made a similar sound back, not matching it, just answering. They stood at the window together until Soli fell off the wall with a crash that woke everyone, and the morning became loud and tangled, and full of the specific chaos of 7 juveniles trying to have breakfast at the same time. Dara moved through it like someone who had learned the pattern. The paper would be read and argued over for years. The galaxy would have opinions. The councils would convene. The words would accumulate the way words did around anything that people did not have the right category for yet. But the sun was up over Ashvin 3. Fen's wing had come to rest across Dara's shoulders the way it sometimes did in the mornings. And in the corner, Soli was attempting to teach Chalk the 4-note whistle with considerable persistence and zero success. It was a good morning. It was enough.